everybody, and welcome to 2 for Comics. I'm Steve. Today on this episode of Runs, I kind of wanted to keep the October theme going, as far as covering some more spooktacular books, some horror books, kind of that we wouldn't normally cover because of Halloween coming up. This book right here is a book that's came out 1998, so a year over 21 years ago. This book came out through the CLIFFHANGER imprint. The infamous CLIFFHANGER project that starred, at the time, superstar artists such as J. Scott. It was started by Jim Lee, who was kind of ushering in the new wave of image artists that he'd been a part of previously. And it had J. Scott Campbell of Gen 13 fame and Red Hot Joe Madureira of Uncanny X-Men and Humberto Ramos. Humberto Ramos is the guy we're going to be talking about, but it's weird because he was kind of the odd man out in this, because these other guys who came from really hot selling titles were really superstar artists, and then Ramos came off of Impulse, a satellite flash book. But I'd never heard of him before the CLIFFHANGER imprint. But Ramos, we'll talk about Ramos anyway after we talk about the book. But his book was called Crimson. Crimson was published in 1998 through 2001. The first half was through Image Comics, and the second half was through DC Comics after Jim Lee had sold Wildstorm Studio to DC so he could draw Batman. And I think it was the paperbacks or the hardcovers, the omnibuses were published through Boom Studios, I think. But anyway, I digress. Crimson was drawn obviously by Ramos, and I guess some of the concepts were by a couple of his buddies, Carlo Pinto and FG Hunter, I don't know, FGH, which I think they were kind of just buddies who kind of bummed around ideas with Ramos, and he got put the project together with his Impulse collaborator Brian Augustine, who wrote Impulse, was a collaborator with Mark Waid on Flash, Justice League Year One, I think, and wrote a little book you may have heard of called Gotham by Gaslight. They made a movie out of it. And they should make a live-action movie out of it. But anyway, the book we're talking about right now is Crimson. Crimson came out in the late 90s. It definitely feels like a late 90s book, but in a good way. Only because it has a lot of tropes of the late 90s. The end of the Clinton era, beginning of the George W. era, with a lot of excess and a lot of hyper, I can't even think of the word for it. A lot of excess in every sense of the word. The book is about a cast of characters. Alex Elder. It's kind of it's a way to describe the setup. Of kind of like Batman meets Spider-Man meets vampires. Batman meets vampires. Alex Elder's a teenage kid. He then is going out with his buddies. He's a really typical teenager, full of rebellion and angst. I hate my parents. Blah blah blah. He's going out with his buddies. He seems like from how I read it, he seems like a real Upper West Side trust fund kid. So he goes out with his buddies in his cars, and they go partying out in I think Central Park with his girlfriend. He ends up getting jumped by a gang, him and his friends, and they all get killed, because it turns out this group, the gang who was actually more vampires. So they slaughter all his friends, his girlfriend, and everything, and they end up obviously he becomes a vampire. So we have adventures of teenage Alex Elder, a vampire, and he ends up meeting a cast of characters to get introduced. The most prominent is probably Akimus, who is he's kind of not a lot known about his story right away, but he kind of gets explained that he's a Garagorn, I think is the race of a race of people that he belongs to, or used to belong to. He kind of looks like this primordial Neanderthal ape type character. He wears a big robe the entire time throughout the story. Also, there's a Jose, who they call Joe, because apparently America wasn't ready for a Mexican character. He's like an indigenous Mexican character, so Ramos, being a Mexican American himself, really gets to kind of flex his muscles as far as like putting all that heritage inside, like his clothing and the things he would say and stuff. And he's really he was a comic relief character pretty much. Um, Other characters include Scarlet X, who was basically more scantily clad, redheaded version of Silver Sable. I think anyway. She was kind of like Van Helsing meets Jessica Rabbit, pretty much, and was kind of Ramos's tryout for Mary Jane, I think, which I think he had to kind of tone it down a little bit. It also starred who was it? Lysith, I think her name was. She was kind of like the queen of all vampires, and who were the other ones? I can kind of get to them as I talk about the story. So basically, Alex Elder becomes a reluctant vampire, stumbles into Joe. Joe's kind of showing him the ropes as far as like vampire culture, and showing how vampires exist. And he introduces him to Akimus, who Akimus kind of Alex goes under his tutelage basically when he tells Alex a story how Alex is, get this, the chosen one of the vampires who's going to put an end to all vampires in the world. Of course, Alex freaks out. He can't handle this, and then we go through all the tropes of him trying to deny what's happening to him, but ends up accepting it. He ends up confronting the gang and full on kills them. At first, he kind of gets his ass kicked a little bit, but then when he kind of finds out that he's the chosen one, he doesn't have just normal vampire powers. He has powers that vampires have never seen before, and they're all just like a Dragon Ball Z episode where they spend an entire episode going impossible. It's that type of thing. They don't really do that, but they. It's been 20 years, so I may be forgetting some things. But anyway, that's kind of the first storyline of the origin story of Alex Elder. He ends up meeting some more characters called Senator Van Fleet, Victor Van Fleet, who becomes he's running for president. He's also a vampire. Who else? Lysith, who's the queen of all vampires, pretty much, and was basically she was a lover of Akimus back before humanity even started. We get some flashbacks, and some of it's kind of reminiscent to Adam and Eve, where they were kicked out of paradise because of of what they had done. And there's a lot of tropes like that. There's a lot of religious subtext into that, as far as Christianity and Catholicism and all that kind of stuff. Something I was really kind of into at the time because other books I was reading, and a lot of books that were coming out at the time, to be honest with you. And after we deal with the vampire stuff, we had to go into the deep dive stuff, which is foreshadowed in probably my favorite issue. I guess Scarlet gets introduced, but she's basically a Van Helsing character, and they do a whole hunting werewolves type storyline, which is cool. My favorite story issue in the entire series is basically this is one Christmas issue where Alex goes to this cafe, and there's a couple people in there. There's this Jamaican guy, this little goth girl who's kind of all doing one of these, inside the booth, and a waitress. These guys are coming in who are kind of assholes and start really being grabby and offensive and really with the customers. It turns out these characters are getting introduced one by one. There's this one Jack Blackish, and not Jack Black now, maybe like School of Rock with better dressed Jack Black type character who ends up being Zariel, the Archangel of Death. And more and more characters come in, Michael, Gabriel, and all these guys. It ends up being an entire broken family of angels that come in, and they start judging these people inside the cafe. And it's a really cool issue. They end up obviously killing everybody, but they're there to judge Alex because Alex is the chosen one, and they kind of want to maybe there's been so many chosen ones, they kind of want to nip this in the butt before it becomes too big or whatever. So at this point, they're ready to kill Alex because they judge him as guilty and not worth the risk of having him live. And then all of a sudden walks in the door. This other person comes in. He's like, "Don't I get a vote?" And it turns out to be Lucifer, the devil himself, in there, who technically is still an angel. He's a fallen angel, but he's still an angel. So he has the deciding vote basically because they're not the deciding vote, but it ends up being 3-4. And then with him, it ends up being a draw, so they have to kind of reconvene a century. And the way he is, he's really cool. He's like a smooth talking, like a lot of people do, like in movies and whatnot. They kind of make him this really like smooth talking, charismatic type person. Which I mean, if you're the devil and you're supposed to tempt mankind, you kind of have to be, I guess. Um, at that same issue, there's this little homeless girl selling flowers, roses on the side of the road during the winter, who like Alex like spends all his money buying them off her. And then at the end of the issue, the devil's by himself, and he ends up having this conversation with somebody. It's that little girl who's actually God, and he, of course, when the devil leaves, ends up sparing, like bringing all the people back who were judged by the angels. But that kind of brings in a whole other like type storyline. The second half of the book, which they started dealing a lot more, which I really loved. They started dealing a lot more with like angels and demons and like saints and dragons and all that stuff. And the book just really goes off, but like in a good way. Because at the time, I mean, I was a teenager at the time. I was still in high school, and it had all the stuff that just like obviously dragons and like huge like hyper violent like scenes with like gratuitous amounts of blood. But the way Ramos draws it, it's like it's cartoony, so it's not like as like jarring as it would be as like if the book was drawn by like I don't know. Brian Hitch or something, even I don't know. But anyway, but the Ramos is very stylized. Something he has been judged on a lot. I see on the internet a lot of people kind of like hold against him, but I think it's like why would I want everybody to draw the same? So anyway, in the book, we end up Alex obviously ends up beating Lysith, the vampire queen or whatever, and then we start going into these other storylines where we have this cop who ends up investigating where, as far as the world knows, Alex Elder is like kidnapped or gone. A milk carton kid, because like there was never like no one ever found his body, so they thought he was still alive. But this cop ends up investigating where the disappearance of Alex Elder and sees him, but then he starts having flashbacks. He ends up being like the reincarnated Saint George. Well, they call him just like George in it, but this saint from like the old like guys who were like part of the Holy Grail Crusades and all that kind of stuff. We end up getting another Sophie, I think, who's like this angel. I forget her deal is. It's been so long since I've read the book, but she's like this bald angel who like who has like all the battle armor and stuff, and she has a big tattoo on her face, and she's really cool. So we end up going into things where like after the whole vampire thing is over with, we end up going into like the hunt for the Holy Grail. And like angels and demons fighting each other, and there's like dragons, and it's crazy. The art is great in it. Ramos, a lot of people kind of pay attention to the way he draws characters. He's very stylized and draws things very, very cartoony, almost like graffiti style. Early on in his career, anyway. But a lot of people give like don't give credit to him as far as like he's a hugely detailed artist. Like I remember, I never knew who he was when I first started reading the book, but then I started seeing the sketches, and then even some of the backgrounds, like like cathedrals. I've never seen it like so much detail put into things like cathedrals and cityscapes and streets. Like the environment feels so real. If you've ever been to like New York, or even like cities like Boston or Chicago, or whatever, you really in this book you really feel like you're there. He must have done like research for it, because there's parts like where they're in like the ritzy part of like New York, like the Upper West Side, and like and you really feel like you have like the horse and buggy carriages walking around, and like the Central Park and that kind of, well, it's not that's the Upper East Side, but West Side, but if you've ever been to those locations, it really feels like you're there. And like when you're in like the places like like they kind of go like off like as far as like the fights like over like with the angels and stuff like that, it's really like between the art and the colors. Ramos, and as far as like Ramos really puts all he has into it. His designs are just like if this guy were alive back during the Stan Lee, he'd be on par with like Jack Kirby as far as like creating memorable designs, because like every single character he introduces is just like really memorable right away. The story obviously the story wraps up in 2001, and after all is said and done, and you go through all this and all the storylines and the conclusion, the last issue features Joe at a bar, and he's kind of like, and this guy he's telling this whole story. He's been telling this whole story the entire time to some guy at the bar, and this guy is like dragons and vampires and like gods and comic books. So he goes, it sounds like a comic book. And it turns out Joe, and Joe's like, I'm telling you, man, I was there. It all happened. And so he ends up walking out of the bar, and like, Joe's a vampire, so obviously he has to be in the dark. But he walks out in just broad daylight, and like you see characters like like Senator Van Fleet, like a homeless guy with like the Van Fleet for President button on him, and like you see like other parts of the storyline, like as they're walking away. So you kind of get the feeling that either this was like this never happened, this was just like a drunk story that like Joe was telling somebody at a bar, so it was all bullshit, or it really did happen. So I mean, it ends really cool. I really like the ending to it. I don't care if it was fake or not. It was still a cool story. They're comics, so they're all fake. But as far as the book goes as a whole, it's Ramos. This is him really kind of getting into his own. This is before he made the jump to Marvel. He ended up doing I think like the bulk of Dan Slott's 10-year Amazing Spider-Man. Did some X-Men stuff, and yeah, he has a lot of the same tropes from before. He's still very talented, still hyper detailed when it comes to cityscapes and that kind of thing. But he's kind of cleaned up his proportions and the way he draws faces. Before it was very like cartoony and very like stylized. I think it influenced a lot of artists, like guys like Scotty Young and Jeff Matsuda, a couple other guys I'm blanking on right now. It wasn't at the time. It wasn't as popular because it wasn't as he didn't have like the juice or the polish that the guys like Jessica Campbell and Joe Mad had kind of like honed during their careers. They've been doing it for so long professionally. But one thing he had up on those guys was he had a better work ethic because he was the only guy to finish his book on time. I think actually to just finish his book for CLIFFHANGER, because I think J. Scott Campbell actually had to end his prematurely at issue 7 because he just like couldn't handle the deadline. Joe Madureira actually went like months and years between issues before he just like walked away from it without telling anybody for video games, and he's never finished it. He's come out with video games since then. He's come out with several collector like hardcovers and trade paperbacks. He's charged like $100 for like a non-finished story. So I don't know, and he's had a Kickstarter to finish the book, and I don't know where the guy gets the balls. He's done several series for Marvel, so it's not like he can't draw when he's getting paid. So, but Ramos, yeah, he finished his book. That was kind of like the main thing too. Why I picked up the book originally, because it was I was a huge supporter of CLIFFHANGER, and he was the only one pumping out issues pretty much. He actually came back for a second series called Out There. It was okay. It wasn't as good as Crimson, I don't think. This book had like the creative team was great. Augustin, his scripts were just really tight. He kind of honed his craft during Impulse as far as how to write teenagers and that kind of thing. He was inked by Ramos was inked by who I think is his best inker is Sandra Hope, who I think came over for a couple of issues of his X-Men. We did some X-Men stuff, and the colors were literally badass. It was by Badass Studios, who if you read the book right now, I'll put some pictures in there, but the colors are just beautiful. Beautiful, bright color, especially considering the subject matter with like vampires and blood and demons. The colors make it really pop. When it's nighttime and there's street lights going, it really it's so great. Things like fire. It's a really good looking book. Good looking book. And yeah. What else can I say about it? At the time, I read the books at the time. I was really kind of into the subject matter a little bit. America during the 90s was kind of really deep into aliens and conspiracies and that kind of thing. And then somewhere around the line, around the late 90s, they kind of traded aliens for like angels and demons, or angels anyway, mostly, in both comics and in Hollywood. In comics, I was actually really into, at the time I was into two books in particular while I was reading this book, which was Kevin Smith's Guardian Devil storyline from Marvel Knights with Joe Quesada, who really had deep dives into Catholicism and the Antichrist and that kind of thing. And also a little book you may have heard of called Preacher, which I was really into at the time too. So I was really into that kind of stuff. There were also a lot of movies that came out at that time, like End of Days and Stigmata and that kind of thing. But yeah, for some reason we just all became obsessed with not religion, but this kind of I don't know, world building with religious aspects. I don't know, but yeah, so that book kind of hit me at the right time, and obviously, like, you know, I was a teenager, so it dealt a lot of, like, you know, teen angst and, like, you know, violence and stuff, like, you know, which I really liked. I think Limp Bizkit was around that time, so it was really, like, you know, break stuff type period. As far as the book holds up, I actually I looked through it. I have most of the series in physical form. I flipped through them, and it really does hold up. I mean, right now, I would definitely read the entire series if I had the time. I remember liking the story a lot, and you know, and the art really holds up. I wish like they'd get the band back together, and like, you know, at the very least do another Cliffhanger series, if not just get the whole Cliffhanger. Did I say Cliffhanger Crimson? Get a new Crimson series, and best case scenario, get the whole Cliffhanger team back together. Even like Chris Boccello, who did Steampunk, and Lionel Francis Yu, who did the not remembered High Roads book. So yeah, I mean, the book's really good. Definitely check it out. If you're, it was really ahead of its time. You know, I think 4 years later, Ramos kind of missed the boat. Well, he was kind of too early for the boat and left. Things like Underworld and the Twilight book started happening, and vampires and that kind of thing, and werewolves really blew up. He could have, you know, could have been there. He could have been the Mexican Robert Kirkman of his time if you really capitalized on it during that time. But you know, you live and you learn, I guess. So yeah, that's about it. Crimson, check it out. We're gonna do another. I think there's 2 more weeks till Halloween. We'll do some more spooky books. I got one in particular that I'm really looking forward to talking about. And I'll see you guys next time. See you later. Like and subscribe and crush that bell. Boo!